The morning Beatrice Donnelly rode into Caldwell, Kansas, with nothing but a battered trunk, a stubborn mare named Clover, and every last dollar she had sewn into the hem of her traveling skirt. The townspeople stopped what they were doing and stared at her the way people stare at something they cannot quite categorize, with equal measures of curiosity and suspicion. It was the late summer of 1879, and Caldwell sat at the edge of cattle country like a man leaning too far over a fence, half desperate for what lay beyond and half terrified of falling. The town had a saloon, a general store, a church that listed slightly to the left, and more opinions per square foot than any place Beatrice had ever encountered in her 26 years of living. She had come from St. Louis, where she had spent 3 years keeping books for a textile merchant who paid her half what he would have paid a man and thanked her even less. She was educated, practical, and possessed of a stubbornness that her mother had always called a character flaw, and her father had always called the finest thing about her. Her father was dead now, gone since the winter before, and his passing had unmoored her from St. Louis as cleanly as a knife cuts rope. She had no reason to stay and every reason to go somewhere she might actually be useful. The advertisement had appeared in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in the first week of June. It had been brief, almost terse, placed under the category of help wanted in language so plain it nearly failed to catch her eye. It read, "Rancher in Sumner County, Kansas, seeks experienced hand familiar with livestock and land management. Room and board provided. Wages fair. Inquire by letter to O. Abbott, Abbott Ranch, Caldwell, Kansas. No references required, only honest work. No references required." That had been the part that stopped her. Every other position she had applied for in those 3 years had required letters of recommendation, personal histories, character witnesses, all the paperwork by which polite society decided whether a woman like Beatrice deserved to be taken seriously. O. Abbott had asked for none of that, just honest work. She had written back the same afternoon. She had stated her qualifications plainly. She could manage accounts. She had grown up on her father's farm in Missouri and knew cattle and horses. She was not afraid of hard labor, and she was available immediately. She had signed the letter B. Donnelly, deliberately leaving her given name ambiguous, though she had not been dishonest about it either. She had simply allowed the initial to do what initials sometimes did, give the reader the freedom to assume. The reply had come 6 weeks later, brief and formal, position still available. Arrive before end of August if you intend to take it. O. Abbott. She had arrived on the 22nd of August, the thermometer already climbing past 90 degrees before 10 in the morning, the dust rising in pale clouds from under Clover's hooves as she made her way down the main street of Caldwell. She stopped at the general store first, because she needed to ask directions and because she needed to see who these people were, the ones who lived in the same town as the man she had agreed to work for. The storekeeper was a wide man named Harlan Briggs, who had the look of someone who had been mildly disappointed by every piece of news he had ever received. He listened to her ask for directions to the Abbott Ranch with an expression that shifted from surprise to something that resembled pity, and then he leaned on his counter and said, "You the new help Orville went and hired?" "I believe so," Beatrice said. "If Orville is the O in O. Abbott." "Lord above," Harlan said, and he shook his head slowly, as a man does when he sees a child about to touch something hot. "Miss, did that man tell you about his condition?" Beatrice had learned in 26 years that the best response to a question posed in that particular tone was to say nothing and wait. She waited. Harlan seemed to take her silence as permission to deliver the full weight of what he considered her imminent tragedy. "Orville Abbott has been blind going on 3 years, he said. "Went blind in both eyes from a fever that took his wife too. He's out there on that land all by himself with a foreman who quit last spring and a herd that's been hemorrhaging stock since June. The man cannot see his hand in front of his face. He cannot run that ranch. Half this town has told him to sell and move in with his brother in Wichita. He won't hear of it." He paused for effect. "No pun intended." Beatrice let a moment pass. Then she said, "How do I get to the ranch?" Harlan blinked. "Did you hear what I just said?" "I heard every word of it," she said pleasantly. "Which road?" She found the Abbott Ranch 4 miles south of town, down a road that wound through short grass prairie, and crossed a shallow creek that Clover picked her way across with dignified caution. The ranch came into view slowly, the way things do on flat land, first the windmill turning lazily against the white sky, then the barn roof, then the fence line, and finally the house itself, a solid wood-framed structure that had once been whitewashed and needed to be again. It was not falling down, but it was tired. The kitchen garden to the east of the house had gone mostly to weed, and the gate on the cattle pen hung at an angle that told its own story about deferred maintenance. She tied Clover to the hitching post and walked to the front door. She knocked. She heard nothing for a long moment, and then she heard boots on a wood floor, deliberate and measured, the walk of someone who had memorized the distance between every piece of furniture in a room. The door opened, and Orville Abbott stood in it. She had not known what to expect. She had built a picture of him in her mind during those weeks of travel, something vague and general, the way you picture any stranger. What she had not expected was a man of 32 who stood an inch over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled the doorway and dark hair that needed cutting, and a jaw that could have been cut from the same limestone that made up the creek beds of this country. His eyes were dark brown and looked at her, not through her. They were clear and present, and the blindness that had been described to her did not announce itself in any grotesque way. It was only when she watched him orient himself to the sound of her voice, turning his face just slightly to the left of where she actually stood, that she understood the full truth of what she had walked into. "I am Beatrice Donnelly," she said. "I wrote you about the position." There was a pause. She could see his mind working through the implications of a woman's voice. His expression did not collapse into embarrassment or irritation, which she noted and appreciated. He simply said, "B. Donnelly." "Yes." "You are a woman." "I am," she said. "I trust that is not a condition of employment you failed to mention, like the blindness." The pause that followed was longer, and something moved in his face, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. "Come in," he said at last, and he stepped back to let her through. The inside of the house was cleaner than she had expected, and she realized that cleanliness, at least, had been a priority he had maintained even without sight. The floors were swept, the dishes stacked, the furniture in orderly positions. But there were other things: a lamp with an empty reservoir sitting dark, a window that had lost a pane of glass and been stuffed with burlap, a calendar on the wall still turned to April because there had been no one to turn it. These were the details of a man managing alone, and managing imperfectly. He gestured toward the kitchen table with an accuracy that told her he moved through this space the way she would move through a room with her eyes closed after having memorized it in the light. She sat down. He sat across from her. "You should know," he said, "that this ranch is in bad shape. I will not pretend otherwise. I have 600 acres, 140 head of cattle, a horse herd that needs tending, and a well that wants cleaning. My last foreman left in April. I have been managing alone since then." "How?" she asked, not challengingly but with genuine curiosity. He was quiet for a moment, as though he were deciding how honest to be. "Poorly," he said finally. "I know every inch of this land by memory. I know the sound of each gate, the feel of the ground changing under my boots. I can do more than people in town believe I can. But there are things I cannot do alone. The account books have gone untouched for 3 months. The fence on the east pasture was reported broken to me in July by a neighbor's boy, and I still do not know its full extent. I cannot read a contract or write a letter without help." "I can do all of that," Beatrice said. "I do not doubt that you can," he said. "What I need to know is whether you understand what this situation is. People in Caldwell are waiting for this ranch to fail. Some of them are waiting to buy the land at ruin prices." I have held on because this land was my father's, and I intend to pass it to someone who will be my own. But the harvest this year must be good enough to prove the ranch is viable, or the bank in Wichita will call in my loan. I have until October." Beatrice looked at him, this man who sat across from her with his hands flat on the table, speaking with a plainness that she found more appealing than any charm she had ever encountered, and she said, "Then we have work to do before October." "When do I start?" he said. "You already have." The first week was a negotiation between two people who were both accustomed to independence and neither of whom had asked for partnership. Beatrice moved her trunk into the spare room at the back of the house, a small space that smelled of cedar and old wool, and she unpacked her things with the brisk efficiency of someone who had learned not to become attached to arrangements before they were tested. She spent the first day walking the property with Orville, which was an education in itself. He walked beside her with a cedar walking stick, but he used it more for reading the terrain than for balance. He knew where every fence post stood, where the land dipped and the water collected after a rain, where the soil changed from good grass-growing earth to the sandier ground near the creek. He narrated as they walked, not because he needed to explain himself but because he was telling her what she needed to know, and the difference mattered. "The east fence," he said when they had covered most of the property. "I need your eyes on it." She looked. She told him what she saw, 40 yards of broken rail fence where something large had pushed through, she guessed cattle from the hoofprints, and another section where the posts had simply rotted at the ground line and fallen inward. "We will need new posts," she said. "There are posts cut in the barn," he said. "I cut them in June. I cannot string the wire alone." "Then we will do it together," she said. He turned his face toward her. The sun was behind her, and she had the impression that he was reading something from the sound and proximity of her voice. "You know how to string fence wire. My father and I fenced 200 acres in Missouri," she said. "I was 9 the first time I helped, and I was better at it than the hired hand by the time I was 12. The ghost of that almost smile appeared again. 12 years old," he said. "Your father was not a conventional man." "He was the finest man I ever knew," she said simply, and something in the way she said it closed the subject with respect rather than grief. The fence took them 3 full days of hard, careful work. Beatrice learned quickly how to divide the tasks, so that Orville's blindness became only one factor among many rather than the defining limitation. Everyone in town had made it. He was enormously strong, and he could drive fence posts with a precision that came from years of physical memory. She guided the wire, read the tension, checked the alignment. They worked with very little wasted motion, and by the end of the 3rd day the east fence was sound. On the 4th morning she found the account books in the desk drawer where he told her to look, and she spread them across the kitchen table and spent the morning going through them. The numbers told a story of a ranch that had been well managed for years, and then suddenly, catastrophically disrupted. She could see the exact point where Orville's wife had died and the blindness had come. Everything before that date was meticulous. Everything after was sparse and then absent entirely. His wife's name had been Clara. He did not speak of her, but Beatrice found her handwriting in the old ledger entries, small and neat and precise, and she understood something about the silence Orville kept around that part of his history. She rebuilt the accounts from the notes she could find, receipts stuffed in a tin box, a few letters from the cattle buyer in Wichita, a bill of sale from the previous October. It took her 4 days of steady work, and when she was done she had a clear picture. The ranch was not ruined, but it was fragile. The debt to the Wichita bank was real, and the deadline was real. They needed a successful cattle drive to market before the 1st of October, and they needed the hay harvest to come in clean so the animals that wintered on the property would survive in sellable condition. She sat down across from him one evening after supper. She had taken over the cooking as well, because it was practical, and laid out the numbers in plain language, reading each one aloud so he could hear the full picture. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, and she watched his hands on the table, the way they were pressed flat and still. "How bad?" he asked. "Not as bad as it could be," she said honestly. "We have a margin. It is thin, but it is there. If we get the cattle to market at or above last year's prices and the hay harvest does not fail, we will make the bank payment with enough left over to carry through winter. And if the cattle prices drop, then we need to think about supplementing," she said. "What else does this land produce that you have not been using?" He was quiet again, but this time the quality of the silence was different. It was thoughtful rather than heavy. "The alfalfa field on the west section," he said. "I planted it 2 years ago but have not had the hands to cut and bale it properly. Clara thought we might sell it directly to the horse ranches to the north. They always need quality feed. Is the crop still good?" "It should be. The field was in full growth last June when my foreman was still here." "Then I need to see it," she said. And the next morning they walked the west section together, and she found the alfalfa standing tall and full and extraordinarily green against the dry summer landscape. A field that had been planted with foresight and had grown unattended into something worth real money. "This is a fine field," she told him. She wanted to give him the precise picture her eyes could provide. "It is better than I expected. 3 cuttings before the frost if the weather holds and we move quickly. I think you should send word to the horse ranches north of here about purchasing directly. Cut out the middleman in Wichita." "That will make enemies of the middleman in Wichita," he said. "He is already your creditor," she said. "I think his opinion of you is already established." He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, and it transformed his whole face, deep and genuine, a sound that came from somewhere unguarded. She felt something shift in the vicinity of her chest, quiet and uninvited, and she chose not to examine it. The town of Caldwell examined it for her. Word traveled fast in a place with nothing more urgent to occupy it, and within 2 weeks of Beatrice's arrival, the consensus of Caldwell was that Orville Abbott had lost his mind along with his sight by hiring a woman from the city to run his ranch. The women who gathered at the church quilting circle repeated various versions of how it would surely end in scandal or ruin, or possibly both. The men at the saloon bet on how many weeks before she gave up and left. Harlan Briggs at the general store told anyone who bought tobacco that the Abbott Ranch would be for sale before Christmas. Beatrice became aware of all this gradually, through small encounters that accumulated like stones in a stream. When she drove the wagon into town to pick up supplies, conversations sometimes paused in ways that were not coincidental. When she asked Harlan Briggs for credit against the ranch's account, he told her with barely concealed satisfaction that the Abbott account's credit terms were under review by the store, and he would need to consult with the owner before extending anything. She paid cash and drove back to the ranch and said nothing to Orville about it. But he knew. He was not a man who missed things simply because he could not see them. He had 3 years of experience in reading the world through information that did not require eyes, and he understood Caldwell the way you understand a landscape you have walked 1,000 times, by its contours and its sounds and its silences. One evening in the second week, when the sun had gone down and the prairie outside was settling into its night sounds, the insects beginning, the coyotes distant and mournful, he said without preamble, "They are talking about you in town." She was mending a shirt at the kitchen table by lamplight. "I assumed as much," she said. "Does it bother you?" She thought about it honestly. "It makes me want to prove them wrong," she said, "which is not entirely the same thing as bothering me." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Clara used to say that the cruelest thing small people do is shrink the world to their own size and then insist everyone else must fit inside it." It was the first time he had spoken his wife's name in her presence, and she heard the care with which he said it, not grief that was still open and bleeding, but grief that had become a permanent element of his interior landscape, like a stone in a field that you learn to plow around. She responded to it with the same care. "She was right," Beatrice said. And your Clara sounds like she was a woman worth knowing." "She was," he said. "You would have liked each other, I think." He paused. "She would have liked you." Beatrice set down the shirt she was mending and looked at him across the table, at the way the lamplight fell on the angular planes of his face and turned his dark eyes amber, and she said quietly, "That is a kind thing to say." "It is a true thing," he said, which was not the same as kindness, and they both understood that. September came in on a wave of dry heat that threatened the alfalfa and sent Beatrice out to the field every morning before 6 to check the ground moisture and watch the sky for the clouds that might or might not bring relief. She had written 3 letters to horse ranches north of Caldwell in the final week of August, and had received 2 replies expressing interest in the alfalfa crop at prices substantially better than the Wichita middleman would have offered. She had arranged the first sale herself, negotiating by mail with a directness that apparently surprised the buyers, who had expected to be dealing with Orville himself, and were obliged to revise their assumptions when the letter they received was signed in a woman's clean and confident hand. The first cutting of alfalfa happened in the first week of September. Beatrice hired 2 men from town for the cutting, the only 2 who responded to her notice without visible reluctance, and she worked alongside them in the field while Orville moved among the rows with a precision that astonished the hired men more than she had thought it would. He could feel the dried cut stems under his boots, could orient himself to the wind to know which direction he was walking, could lift a bale of hay and know by its weight and density whether it had been properly dried before baling. By the end of the second day in the field, the younger of the 2 hired men, a sunburned boy of about 20 named Dewey, was watching Orville work with an expression that Beatrice recognized as the particular revision of opinion that comes when reality fails to match a story you were told. "I heard in town he could barely feed himself," Dewey said quietly to her during a water break, watching Orville stack bales along the fence line with steady, methodical strength. "People in town see what they expect to see," Beatrice said. "Or rather, they see the absence of what they expected and conclude nothing remains." Dewey thought about this with the careful attention of a young man working through something for the first time. "That is not fair," he concluded. "Very little is," she said, and handed him the water canteen back, and they went back to work. There was a man named Clifton Garvey who owned the second largest spread in Sumner County and who had made no secret of his interest in the Abbott land. He was a rancher of 50-something with leathery skin and a manner of speaking that was always one layer too pleasant, the kind of pleasant that made you aware of what it was covering. He came to the ranch on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of September, arriving on a fine bay horse and removing his hat with the exaggerated courtesy of a man who wants to make his condescension look like charm. Beatrice met him at the gate because Orville was in the barn, and she heard the horse coming before it arrived. She had an instinct for Clifton Garvey the moment she saw him, the way she had always had an instinct for the sort of businessman who wore friendliness as a tool of negotiation. "I am looking for Orville Abbott," Garvey said, letting his eyes travel over her with an assessment she chose to receive as simply the price of doing business in this time and this place. "He is occupied at the moment," she said. "I am Beatrice Donnelly. I manage the ranch." Garvey's smile shifted in a way that was technically imperceptible but absolutely apparent to anyone paying attention. "Is that right? Well, I have been a friend and neighbor to Orville for many years, and I would very much like to speak with him directly." "You are welcome to wait," she said, and her voice was polite enough that he could not object to it, but firm enough that he understood waiting was his only option. Orville emerged from the barn 10 minutes later, having heard the horse arrive, and taken exactly as long as he needed to finish what he was doing before coming to greet a visitor whose arrival he had likely anticipated in some form. He walked to the gate with the unhurried steadiness of a man on his own land, and said, "Clifton," in the tone of a man who has already taken the measure of what is about to be said. Garvey made his offer over the course of about 15 minutes of conversation that he dressed up as neighborly concern. He spoke about the hardship of running a ranch alone, about the fairness of the price he was prepared to offer, about how Orville's brother in Wichita would surely want him to be practical. He did not look at Beatrice during any of this, which was, she thought, its own kind of statement. Orville listened with his face turned slightly in the direction of Garvey's voice. When the man finished, Orville said, "I appreciate the thought, Clifton. The answer is no. It was no in April, and it was no in July, and it is no today." Orville. "The answer is no," Orville repeated, with a pleasantness that was identical in quality to Garvey's own but distinctly less two-faced about what it was. "Good afternoon." Garvey left. After his horse disappeared down the road, Orville said without turning around, "He will come back." "I know," Beatrice said. "He has been trying to buy this land since 2 months after Clara died," Orville said. "He made an offer at her funeral." Beatrice was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "That is a particular kind of indecency," she said finally. "It is," he agreed. He turned toward her then, his face orienting to the sound of her voice with an accuracy that she had come to find less remarkable and more simply characteristic of him. "I am grateful you were here when he came." "I was here because I work here," she said. "Yes," he said, "but I am still grateful." She did not know what to do with that, so she went back to work, which was generally what she did when she encountered something she did not yet know how to carry. The hay harvest was the first real test of whether Beatrice's management of the ranch was going to hold. She had been keeping a careful eye on the weather, on the state of the fields, on the 2 hired men she had kept on through the 2nd week and the 3rd. She had also, on a practical impulse she had not fully examined at the time, written to her cousin in Missouri who had a draft horse for sale, negotiating a price that was fair to both sides, and arranging for the animal to be driven out by a neighbor's son who was heading west anyway. The draft horse arrived on the 10th of September, a broad roan gelding named George, who added considerably to the ranch's capacity for heavy hauling. Orville ran his hands over George the afternoon the horse arrived, reading the animal the way Beatrice had seen him read everything he could not see, with thorough and deliberate touch, learning the horse through his hands the way you might read a page of text. George stood with the tranquil patience of a horse accustomed to being handled and seemed to find nothing alarming about the examination. "Good shoulders," Orville said. "How much?" she told him. He nodded slowly, and she could see him calculating. "That is fair," he said. "Was it your cousin?" "Yes," she said. "You used your own connections to help this ranch," he said. "It was not precisely a question." "I used what was available," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Beatrice." He said her name as though he were picking it up carefully, as though it had weight and he wanted to be certain of his grip. "I would like you to know that I am aware of everything you have done since you arrived. The fence, the accounts, the alfalfa sales, the horse. I am not a man who fails to notice things." "I did not assume you were," she said. "Then I will say plainly that what you have done here in 3 weeks is more than I had hoped for and considerably more than I had a right to expect." He paused. "Thank you." She looked at him, this man who stood in the late afternoon light with his hand still resting on the neck of the new draft horse, who had built something real on this land and refused to abandon it because the world told him he should. And she felt the thing in her chest that she had been carefully not examining for 3 weeks begin to insist on being examined. She said, "You are welcome," and the steadiness of her own voice surprised her. The cattle drive to Wichita was arranged for the last week of September. Beatrice had spent considerable time on the logistics of this, communicating with the cattle buyer in Wichita, arranging the route, negotiating with 2 of the neighboring ranchers to combine their drives for efficiency and safety. Orville had contacts and a reputation built over years, and she used both, sending letters in his name and sometimes in her own, always clear about her role and never misrepresenting it. Dewey came on as a regular hire and brought his older brother, a quiet man named Thomas, who rode well and asked no unnecessary questions. They hired a third man recommended by the preacher's wife, a point of origin that Beatrice found obscurely reassuring, and on the 21st of September they moved the cattle. Orville Road. This was the part that Beatrice had thought most carefully about, because she understood what it would mean to the town and to Orville's own dignity, and she was determined to get it right. She had spent a week riding out with him in the mornings, letting him reacquaint himself with his horse, a pale gray gelding named Dust, who clearly remembered his rider and carried him with a responsiveness that spoke to their history together. She described the terrain as they rode, not because he did not know it, but because she was updating his knowledge with current conditions, the same way you might tell a friend returning from a long journey what had changed in their absence. By the third morning he was riding with confidence, and she rode beside him, and they moved along the fence lines and across the fields with a coordination that required almost no speech, because they had somehow, in 3 weeks, learned a great deal about how the other moved through the world. The cattle drive took 4 days. Beatrice rode every mile of it, which was not something the neighbors who had agreed to combine their drives had anticipated, and there was a brief but definitive conversation on the first morning when one of the other ranchers, a man named Prescott, who was large in the way of a man who had once been strong and was now mostly broad, said directly to Orville that he was not comfortable having a woman riding drive. Orville said, "She is my ranch manager. She rides. If that is a problem, you can drive your cattle separately and pay the full cost of the journey on your own." He said it with perfect equanimity, as though he were discussing the weather, and he turned his face toward Prescott with those dark eyes that saw nothing and somehow communicated everything, and Prescott decided it was not a problem after all. They drove 137 head of cattle into Wichita on the 25th of September. The price was better than the previous year, which Beatrice had gambled on based on the market reports she had been reading in the newspapers that came weekly to the Caldwell General Store, and the sale was completed in a single afternoon. When the buyer paid, he paid to Orville Abbott, and the amount in Orville's hand was enough to cover the bank loan, with a remainder that made Beatrice close her eyes for a brief private moment of relief. They stayed the night in Wichita at a modest hotel before the return journey. The evening of their arrival, after the hired men had gone to their own accommodations, and the business of the day was settled, Beatrice and Orville sat in the hotel dining room and ate a proper meal for the first time in a month. It was an almost absurdly ordinary event, and yet it felt like something else entirely. He had tidied himself for the occasion, fresh shirt, hair combed, the jaw clean-shaved, and she had changed into the better of the 2 dresses she had brought from St. Louis, a deep green wool that had been impractical for ranch work, but which she had packed out of a stubbornness she could not entirely account for. They sat across from each other in a room with other people around them, lamps on the tables and the smell of decent food, and there was something strange and fine about being 2 people in a dining room who had just successfully done a hard thing together. She described the room to him quietly as they ate, not because he asked, but because she had started doing this generally, giving him the pictures that her eyes had and his could not, and it was something that had grown between them naturally, like a habit formed without intending to form one. He said, as she was describing the way the light came through the front window, "What are you wearing? I realize I have not heard you in anything other than work clothes since you arrived." The question surprised a short laugh out of her. "A green dress," she said. "It was probably a foolish thing to pack." "Is it the color you prefer?" he asked. "I think it is," she said. "I have not thought about it in a while." "You should," he said quietly. "Think about it." She looked at him across the table and felt with a clarity that was almost physical the understanding that what existed between them had long since moved past the category of employer and employee, past the practical partnership that had defined the last month, into something she did not have an easy word for, but that she was no longer willing to pretend she did not feel. She said, "Orville." He waited. "I wrote to your advertisement because I needed work," she said. I want you to know that I am still glad I came, for reasons that have nothing to do with needing work. I want to be plain about that." He was quiet for a long moment, and she watched his hands on the table, those capable hands that could string fence wire and drive a post and read a horse's condition by touch, and she waited with the patience she had always had for things that mattered. He said, "I have not wanted to say certain things to you because I did not want you to feel that you owed them to me." "I do not owe you anything beyond honest work," she said, "which I have given. Anything beyond that is its own matter." He looked toward her, that turn of the head that had become as familiar to her as any gesture she had ever known on a human face, and he said, "When you walk into the kitchen in the morning before you say a word, I know you are there because of the way the air in the room changes. I have been trying for 3 weeks to decide whether that was something I was allowed to feel or whether I was simply a lonely man confusing gratitude for something else." "Is it something else?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "I believe it is." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, which was perhaps forward for 1879 in a hotel dining room with other guests present, and she discovered she was entirely at peace with that. His hand turned over under hers and held it. "Good," she said. They rode back to Caldwell the next day in the long golden light of late September, and if the hired men noticed that something had shifted between the ranch manager and the rancher, they were sensible enough not to comment on it, which raised Beatrice's opinion of both of them considerably. The Caldwell gossip machine did not wait long to respond to the news of the successful cattle sale. Word reached town on the afternoon of the 26th, brought by the cattle buyer's telegraph to Harlan Briggs at the general store, because Harlan Briggs had a habit of positioning himself at the intersection of all significant information flows. The response among certain quarters was something that could not quite be called happiness, because Caldwell's investment in Orville Abbott's failure had been considerable. What followed was the curious social phenomenon of a town being proved wrong and needing to reorganize its narrative. Some people simply adjusted without comment, as people sometimes do. Dewey's mother, who had publicly worried about the impropriety of Beatrice living under the same roof as an unmarried man, now described Beatrice as a capable and admirable woman. The woman who ran the millinery, who had never spoken to Beatrice directly in her several trips to town, now nodded to her warmly when she passed. These small recalibrations happened one after another in the weeks following the cattle sale, unannounced and unremarkable except in aggregate. Clifton Garvey did not recalibrate. He was a man who had committed himself to a view of events that served his interests, and the failure of that view to correspond to reality was not something he responded to gracefully. He came to the ranch a second time in the first week of October, and this time his pleasant manner was wearing thin in ways that were plainly visible around the edges. Beatrice was in the kitchen garden when he arrived, turning over the soil for the season. She heard his horse and came around the side of the house before he reached the door. "Mr. Garvey," she said pleasantly. He looked at her with an expression that had given up pretending to be neighborly. "I need to speak with Orville." "He is busy," she said. "Can I help you?" "You cannot," he said. "This is between me and Orville Abbott, and it is a legal matter." Orville appeared in the doorway at that moment, because Orville had excellent hearing and had, she suspected, been listening for exactly this kind of development. He stepped out onto the porch and said, "What legal matter, Clifton?" Garvey reached into his coat and produced a document, which he unfolded with the theatrical air of a man who has been looking forward to a scene. "It has come to my attention," he said, "that the boundary survey on your east section may have placed the fence line incorrectly. I have had my own surveyor look at it, and he believes approximately 40 acres on the east side of your fence belong to me." There was a silence. Beatrice looked at the document from several feet away and saw that it was a surveyor's report with a hand-drawn map, and she thought of the east fence she and Orville had repaired in the first week of her arrival, and a cold and deliberate calm settled over her. She said, "May I see that document?" Garvey looked at her as though the question were an impertinence, which he clearly found it to be. But Orville said, "Show her," and Garvey, calculating, handed it to her. She read it carefully while both men waited. She was good at reading documents. It was, after all, a significant part of what the textile merchant had paid her for in St. Louis, and she read this one with care. Then she said, "This survey is dated the 14th of September. "Yes," Garvey said, "and your surveyor is one William Cross of Caldwell. He is a professional." "He may be," she said, "but the original survey of this land is on record with the Sumner County Land Office, filed in 1871, and a copy is in this house in the deed box. If there is a discrepancy between that survey and this one, the one on record with the county takes precedence until a formal dispute is filed and reviewed." She handed the document back to him. "If you believe you have a legitimate claim, you should file it with the county. In the meantime, the fence stays where it is." Garvey looked at her for a long moment, and she held his gaze with the calm certainty of someone who knows they are right and has done the reading to prove it. He said, "You are very sure of yourself." "I am very sure of the law," she said pleasantly. "Good afternoon, Mr. Garvey." He left. He did not come back. In the second week of October, Orville asked Beatrice to sit with him on the porch after supper, which had become a regular thing between them in the evenings, sitting together, as the stars came out over the prairie, sometimes talking and sometimes not, in the comfortable way of two people who had grown accustomed to each other's silences. The October air had turned, and there was a cool edge to it that smelled of dried grass and distance, and in the east the sky was a deep clear dark scattered with more stars than could be comfortably counted. He said, "I have been thinking about what comes after winter." She waited. "If the alfalfa field does as well as it did this fall," he said, "we will be in a strong enough position to expand the herd in the spring." I had been thinking about bringing in a second cattle line, possibly a longer-eared breed, something more suited to the southern markets. There is a man near Dodge City who is working with them. That would require more pasture management, she said. "Yes," he said. "Which requires a ranch manager." He paused. "I want you to stay, Beatrice, not only because you are necessary to the ranch, though you are. I want you to stay because," he stopped. He was a man who chose his words carefully, who had no use for imprecision, and she waited while he found the ones he meant. "I want you to stay because these past weeks have been the first time since Clara died that this house has felt like a place where someone lives rather than a place where someone waits. I want you to stay because I think you are the most capable and honest person I have met in my life. I want you to stay because I believe I am in love with you, and I would like the opportunity to say so properly if you will allow it." The prairie around them was very quiet. Somewhere to the south a coyote called once and was answered by silence. She said, "I did not come to Kansas looking for love." "No," he said, "neither of us was looking for it." "I came to work," she said, "and I have worked. And somewhere in the middle of the work it occurred to me that this is the first place I have been in my adult life where I am fully what I am, and it is not a problem to be managed." She paused. "You have never once asked me to be less than I am." "Why would I?" he said. She reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand, which was becoming a habit she had no interest in breaking. "Then I will stay," she said. "And yes, to the other thing." He squeezed her hand, and the smallest, realest smile she had seen from him, not the ghost of one but the actual thing, appeared on his face in the starlight, and she thought she had never seen anything quite so worth the trouble of the last 2 months. He said, "I should like to do this properly." "I am not concerned with properly," she said. "I know," he said. "That is one of approximately 100 things I love about you. But I should like to ask you to marry me in a way that is worthy of the asking." She looked at him and felt the full weight and warmth of what was sitting there between them on the porch in the October dark, something that had been built from fence posts and account books and alfalfa fields, and 4 days of cattle drive, and 100 small moments of two people learning each other in the particular way that happens when you work alongside someone in real circumstances, without any of the performance that courtship usually requires. She thought it was rather a better foundation than most. She said, "You just did," He said, "Yes, I suppose I did." She said, "Yes." They were married in November, in the church that leaned slightly to the left, because the preacher had been kind to them both, and the church was the only appropriate venue in Caldwell regardless of its architectural opinions. Beatrice wore the green dress from Wichita with a white lace collar that she had ordered from the dry goods catalog and received 3 days before the ceremony, which she considered a small miracle of timing. Dewey and his brother Thomas came, and the preacher's wife who had recommended Thomas came, and several of the neighboring ranchers whose opinions had been revised by the events of the fall. And Orville's brother came down from Wichita for the occasion, a stocky man named Emmett who shook Beatrice's hand with both of his and said, "I cannot tell you how glad I am," in a voice that made her think he had been worrying about his brother for a very long time. Harlan Briggs came to the wedding, which surprised her until she realized that Harlan was the sort of man who could not stay away from any event that might be discussed afterward, and that his presence here would give him something to say that was less uncomfortable than what he had been saying for the previous 3 months. He told her at the reception that she had done fine work with the ranch, and that he had known all along she would make a success of it. She thanked him without a hint of irony, because she was married and happy and could afford to be generous. Orville stood beside her at the front of the church in a dark suit that fit him well and held her hand through the whole ceremony with the quiet certainty of a man who has made a decision he does not intend to revisit. The preacher spoke about patience and trust and the particular strength of people who build things carefully, and Beatrice thought this was either a very perceptive man or someone who had been paying close attention to the last 3 months, and possibly both. When it was done, and they were outside in the November cold with the church bells making their enthusiastic and slightly off-key noise, Emmett shook his brother's hand, and then pulled him into an embrace that lasted longer than any of the men around them were entirely comfortable with, and Orville allowed it without embarrassment, which was one more thing Beatrice loved about him. She stood in the pale November sun in her green dress with the white collar and looked at her husband, who was standing in the middle of Caldwell, Kansas, in 1879, with his face tipped slightly upward as though measuring the temperature of the light, and she felt something so complete and unambiguous that she was not sure she had a name for it, though she thought happiness was somewhere in the vicinity of what she meant. The winter that followed was long and cold, and genuinely difficult in the way that winters on the Kansas prairie were always genuinely difficult, and it was also the most content Beatrice had ever been in her life, which she found instructive. They read aloud to each other in the evenings, taking turns, she reading the newspapers and the cattle journals that came by post, he sometimes reading from memory because he had an extraordinary memory and could recite whole passages of books he had read before his sight was gone, his voice low and certain in the lamp-warm kitchen. They argued about the best approach to expanding the herd in spring with a comfortable vigor, because they were both people who had opinions and preferred to have them heard. They learned each other's habits and edges and preferences with the particular intimacy that comes from sharing a life in close quarters through a hard season. She told him about her father, really told him, more than the brief summaries she had offered before, about the farm in Missouri and the way her father had believed without reservation that she could do anything she set her mind to, and how that belief had been so complete and consistent that she had eventually been unable to disbelieve it herself. About his death the previous winter, which had been quiet and not painful but had left a hole in her that she had not known how to describe until now, talking to someone who understood loss in the specific way that Orville understood it. He told her about Clara. Not reluctantly, and not with the weighted significance of something forbidden, but the way you tell someone about a part of your life that shaped you honestly and with care. Clara had been funny, he said, sharper than anyone expected and funnier than most people knew. She had been the one who insisted on planting the alfalfa field, convinced 2 years ahead of the event that the horse ranches to the north were going to need quality feed as the cattle routes shifted. She had been right, as she usually was about practical matters. He had loved her, and she was gone, and both of those things were true simultaneously and would always be. He did not ask Beatrice to occupy the same place Clara had held, because she was not Clara, and he was not the man he had been when Clara was alive, and they were something different, something new that had been built from what remained. Beatrice understood this with her whole heart and held it carefully, which was the right thing to do. In February, when the cold had settled so deep into the prairie that the ground rang like iron under boots, Beatrice discovered she was expecting a child. She had suspected for 3 weeks before she was certain, and when she was certain she sat down at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning and looked at the account books that were now meticulous and balanced, and told a story of a ranch that had turned itself around, and she felt a joy so large and particular that she sat quite still with it for several minutes before she told Orville. She told him that evening. She simply said, "There is going to be a child," and waited. He was at the other end of the kitchen when she said it, and he went very still in the way he sometimes did when something required his full attention. Then he crossed the room with a speed and certainty that bypassed all the careful navigation he usually employed and found her, both hands coming to her face, his forehead dropping to hers. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "Good," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. "That is good." She put her hands over his on her face, and they stood like that in the kitchen with the winter pressing against the windows. And she thought again about the advertisement she had read in the St. Louis newspaper the previous June, that brief and unadorned notice that had asked for nothing except honest work, and she thought about all the things that had been set in motion by her decision to answer it. The fence, and the accounts, and the alfalfa field, and the cattle drive in Wichita, and the hotel dining room and the October porch. All of it leading to this kitchen and this man and this February evening, and whatever was coming. Spring came to the Kansas prairie the way it always came, not in a single moment but in accumulation, 1 degree of warmth at a time. The grass going from brown to something that was not quite green but was no longer brown, the creek rising, the cattle growing restless with the change in the air. Beatrice managed the ranch through March and April with the practical efficiency that had become her particular signature, her pregnancy growing visible but not impeding her, because she had no patience for impeding, and because there was genuine work to do. They hired a full-time hand in March, a man named Samuel Birch who had worked cattle operations in Texas and come north following the drives, a capable and taciturn man of about 40 who asked no questions about the ranch's management structure, looked once at how things were running, and concluded correctly that he should do his job well and stay out of the way of the system that was already in place. He became invaluable within 2 weeks, which was the fastest Beatrice had ever evaluated a hire. The alfalfa field was planted again in April, expanded by half with the seed money from the fall's profits. The new cattle, 12 head of the southern breed that Orville had been considering since October, purchased from the man near Dodge City, through a correspondence that Beatrice had handled with characteristic thoroughness, arrived in May, and were integrated into the herd with only the expected degree of territorial difficulty. The bank loan in Wichita was paid in full in March. Beatrice made the payment herself, riding to Wichita with Samuel Birch as escort, and delivering the full amount to the bank manager in person, in cash, with the account books that showed the ranch's financial history laid out on his desk, so there could be no ambiguity about the current condition of the operation. The bank manager, a slim man named Frederickson who had clearly been expecting this visit to go differently, looked at the books with the expression of a man whose predictions have been substantially incorrect and said only, "Everything appears to be in order." "It is," she said pleasantly, and rode home with the paid receipt in her pocket and the particular satisfaction of a thing fully resolved. Orville's reaction when she told him the loan was paid was the same quality of stillness she had observed in February, deep and complete, the response of a man feeling something large enough that it requires a moment to contain. He said, "My father borrowed against this land once when the drought took 2 seasons. He was 52 years old before he paid it clear. I did not know if I would ever." He stopped. "You have," she said simply. He found her hand with the accuracy that never failed to reach her. "We have," he said. Their son was born in July, on a hot afternoon with the windows open and the prairie outside shimmering in the heat. The doctor from Caldwell came out in time, which was fortunate, and Dewey's mother came as well, having appointed herself as a helpful presence with the decisive confidence of a woman who had delivered 3 children of her own and considered herself an authority. Orville waited in the kitchen with Samuel Birch, who spent the 2 hours of waiting whittling a small horse from a piece of cedar with careful concentration, the way a man occupies himself when he is trying not to listen to what he cannot help hearing from the other end of the house. When Dewey's mother came out of the bedroom and told Orville he had a son and that Beatrice was fine, Orville Abbott sat down in his kitchen chair and pressed both hands over his face and made no sound for a long enough moment that Samuel Birch set down the cedar horse and said, "You all right?" in the careful voice of a man who suspects he is witnessing a private thing. Orville took his hands from his face. "Yes," he said. His voice was rougher than usual. "Yes, I am all right." They named the boy James Thomas Abbott James for Beatrice's father and Thomas because she liked the name, and because Thomas the hired hand had become a steady presence in their lives, and Orville said that a name was a good thing to choose with intention. James was a dark-haired, loud-voiced infant who demonstrated from his first days on Earth a powerful capacity for opinion that Beatrice recognized as familiar. He had Orville's coloring and her own stubbornness, which she decided was either a blessing or a challenge depending on the day. Orville held his son with a careful and total attention that was something she carried in her heart for the rest of her life. The way his hands learned the infant's face and formed the way they learned everything in the world patiently and thoroughly, and the way James seemed to accept this examination with the tranquil cooperation of a baby who has not yet learned to be afraid of the world. "He has your nose," Beatrice said. "I will take your word for it," Orville said. "It is a good nose," she said, confident. He made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and something else, and she pulled her knees up on the bed and watched her husband hold their son in the July afternoon, and felt so completely situated in the right place and the right life that it was almost difficult to remember who she had been when she arrived in Kansas a year ago. Battered trunk and stubborn mare and every last dollar sewn into the hem of her traveling skirt. The harvest of 1880 was the best the Abbott Ranch had seen in 6 years. Beatrice knew the numbers as intimately as she knew anything, and she watched them come in through September with the satisfaction of someone who has planned carefully and been rewarded for the planning, though she was also practical enough to give appropriate credit to a summer that had brought good rainfall at the right intervals and a cattle market that had remained strong. 3 cuttings of alfalfa, sold directly to the horse ranches at prices that had strengthened as the reputation of the Abbott alfalfa spread. A cattle sale in October that exceeded the previous year by 9%. The kitchen garden yielded more than they needed, and the surplus went to Dewey's mother, who organized a trading arrangement among the neighboring wives that resulted in the ranch receiving preserved goods through the winter in exchange for fresh produce through the growing season, an arrangement that Beatrice considered one of the more elegant pieces of social economy she had encountered. The fall also brought something else, an article in the Caldwell newspaper. The paper's editor, a young man named Harris who had arrived in town the previous spring and was still assembling his understanding of local stories, had been hearing about the Abbott Ranch in the way that interesting things inevitably circulate in small communities, and he came to the ranch in September with a notebook and a polite request to write about what had happened there. Beatrice was initially inclined to decline, on the grounds that she found self-promotion distasteful, and that the story was not, in her view, as unusual as people seemed to think. She said as much to Orville, who considered the question with his characteristic care, and then said, "There are young men in this county who cannot imagine that a blind man can run a working ranch. There are women in Caldwell who have not been permitted to imagine what they might be capable of if given the opportunity. If the story says something true about both of those things, then perhaps it is worth telling." She thought about this for a day. Then she told Harris he could come back on Thursday. The article appeared in the Caldwell paper at the end of September and was picked up by the Wichita Eagle the following week. It was, she thought, a mostly accurate account that contained only the usual slight distortions of newspaper writing. It described Orville's management of the ranch in terms that were honest about the challenges of blindness without being condescending about them. She had been clear with Harris about what she found acceptable, and it described her own role without the kind of breathless astonishment that she had been careful to forestall. What it got right, and she knew it because she recognized it, was the central fact that two people who had been told by the accumulated wisdom of their community that they could not do a thing had done it, and had done it well, and the community was the one that had needed to revise its understanding. Clifton Garvey reportedly did not enjoy the article. She heard this from Dewey, who had grown into a full-time hire, and a young man she was genuinely fond of, and who relayed Garvey's reaction with a grin he did not bother to conceal. The land dispute Garvey had threatened to file was never filed. The county survey records had been quite clear on the matter, as Beatrice had said they would be, and Garvey apparently had enough legal advice to know that pursuing a claim against documented evidence was an expensive way to lose. Emmett Abbott came down from Wichita in October for what was ostensibly a visit, but was transparently a desire to see his brother's life with his own eyes, and confirmed that it was as good as the letters described. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, took one look at the ranch, the sound fences, the substantial barn, the new addition to the house that Beatrice and Orville had planned through the spring and built with Samuel Birch's help through the summer, and said, "All right. It is exactly as good as the letters said. I apologize for doubting." Beatrice handed him James, who was 3 months old and in a serene mood, and said, "Your nephew." Emmett held the baby with the careful awkwardness of a man who does not hold babies often and is aware of his own inexperience, and looked down at the small, serious face with an expression that went soft in the way that hard-edged people sometimes go soft in the presence of new life when they forget to maintain their edges. "He looks like Orville at that age," Emmett said. "So I have been told," Beatrice said. "Orville was a loud baby," Emmett said. "James as well," she said. Emmett laughed. Orville, standing a few feet away with his head turned in the direction of his brother's voice, also laughed, and the three of them stood in the October afternoon outside the house that had been tired and hollow when she arrived 14 months ago and was now solid and warm and thoroughly inhabited, and she thought this was what the word home meant when it was doing its best work. Emmett stayed a week. He and Orville talked for hours every evening after supper, the way brothers talk who have been separated by distance and circumstance, making up for time with quantity and depth of conversation, ranging from the practical to the philosophical to the simply reminiscent. Beatrice listened sometimes and participated sometimes and sometimes left them to it and sat in the addition with James in her arms and the lamp on the table, reading or simply thinking in the particular piece that this house had become. On the last evening of Emmett's visit, Emmett said to Beatrice, when Orville had stepped outside for a moment, "I am going to tell you something. When he wrote me after Clara died, it was the worst I had ever seen him, not the blindness. He had found ways to live with the blindness, but the alone of it, the absolute alone of it, I could not get him to come to Wichita. I could not get him to do anything except hold on to that land and refuse to let go, which I think is the only thing that kept him here, honestly. And then he hired you." He paused. "And he wrote me in September of last year, and the letter was different. Not falsely cheerful. Orville is not a false cheerful man, just different, like something that had been locked had opened." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, He gave me the same thing. I want you to know that. I had no idea how narrow my life had become until I came here and it expanded. Emmett looked at her steadily. Then you are well matched, he said. I think we are, she agreed. Orville came back in, and the evening resumed, and nothing more needed to be said about it because everything that needed saying had been said. The second winter was easier than the first, not because the cold was less, which it was not, but because they knew now what they were doing and how to do it together. James grew from an infant who slept in the drawer of the cedar chest that Orville had emptied and lined with quilts into a baby who sat up and reached for things, and produced an ongoing commentary of sounds that had not yet resolved into words, but were clearly intended as communication. Orville spent long hours with him in the evenings, the two of them engaged in a conversation of sorts, Orville talking, James responding with whatever sounds were available to him, Orville listening to each one with the careful attention he gave to everything. She watched this and found it the finest thing she had ever seen. The spring of 1881 brought three things: the expansion of the herd to 200 head, which they had been working toward since the previous fall, a letter from her cousin in Missouri who was thinking of coming west and wanted to know if there was work in Caldwell, and the first words of James Thomas Abbott, who said Dada with great conviction on a Tuesday morning in April, and reduced his father to a stillness that lasted considerably longer than most silences in that household. Her cousin, a woman of 30 named Eleanor who was handy with animals and had practical skills that Beatrice recognized from their shared upbringing, came west in May and was hired on at a neighboring ranch. One of the ranchers who had revised his opinion of the Abbott operation over the previous 2 years and who asked Beatrice for her recommendation before making the hire. She gave it without reservation. Eleanor settled into Caldwell with the pleased determination of someone who has finally arrived in a place that fits, and became a fixture in Beatrice's life in the particular way that family becomes when you are far from where you started. The summer of 1881 was busy in the expansive and satisfying way that summers are when things are growing and the work has purpose. James toddled around the yard with the sturdy purposefulness of a small person who has recently discovered independent locomotion and is not yet convinced of its limitations. Beatrice managed the ranch with a practiced efficiency that had by now become second nature. The accounts, the correspondence, the herd management, the field schedule, while also being the person who knew where James was at all times and who could simultaneously track a conversation about alfalfa prices, write a letter to a cattle buyer in Kansas City, and listen to make sure the baby had not gotten into the feed buckets again. She had begun to wonder about the next child. She had not said this to Orville yet because she was still deciding whether it was something she wanted or simply something she was anticipating as inevitable, and she found that these were different questions. When she finally concluded that it was indeed something she wanted and said so to Orville on a June evening on the porch, he said, without a moment of hesitation, "Yes," and then was quiet for a moment and said, "I was wondering when you would arrive at that." She gave him a look that he could not see but which he somehow registered anyway, because he had always been remarkable at reading what she did not say. "How could you possibly know I was thinking about it?" "You have been reading the Farming Almanac at night," he said. "You only read the Farming Almanac at night when you are planning something, and you finished the accounting last week, which means you were calculating capacity. And you asked Eleanor last Thursday whether she was staying in Caldwell long-term." She stared at him. "You are an unreasonable person," she said. "You are transparent to people who are paying attention," he said, and the smile was there, the real one, fully present in the June evening light. "I love you," she said, which she said regularly and meant every time. "I know," he said. "I love you back, completely and without reservation." He found her hand in the dark without reaching for it, just turned his palm up and waited for hers to land there, which it did. The second pregnancy was announced in October of 1881, and proceeded through the winter with less anxiety than the first, because they both knew now what they were doing on that front as on all others. Beatrice managed the accounts for winter provisioning, organized the hay supply, supervised the cattle through a cold snap in January that took 3 head to pneumonia, and might have taken more without Samuel Birch's quick response to the dropping temperatures. She was 7 months along when the cold snap hit and directed operations from the kitchen doorway with a blanket around her shoulders, and her voice carrying across the yard to the barn with perfect clarity, which was when Dewey told his brother Thomas, somewhere behind the barn, that he had never met anyone like her in his life, and Thomas said he doubted many people had. The second child was a daughter, born in late February of 1882, a small and fiercely loud person with Beatrice's auburn hair and Orville's jaw, who made her presence known from her first moment, with a thoroughness that suggested she would always have something to say about every situation. They named her Ruth, because Beatrice had always loved the story of Ruth, the loyalty of it, the choosing of it, and Orville agreed immediately, and in a way that told her he had been thinking along similar lines. James, who was not quite 2 when Ruth arrived, regarded his sister with the philosophical uncertainty of a small person encountering a major revision to his world, and then gradually, over the course of the weeks that followed, shifted into a proprietary affection for her that was both genuine and extremely inconvenient for anyone who tried to pick her up without his prior approval. The spring of 1882 was warm and early, and the alfalfa field that Beatrice had expanded 2 years ago was now the most productive acreage on the ranch, its reputation established enough that they had inquiries from as far as Dodge City about purchasing directly. She handled the negotiations herself, as she always did, with the same combination of directness and thorough preparation that had characterized everything she had brought to the Abbott Ranch from the beginning. The prices were good. The ranch was sound, the debt was gone. The land was registered, documented, and defended, and Clifton Garvey had bought a spread to the east the previous fall and seemed to have redirected his ambitions accordingly, which was fine by everyone involved. One afternoon in May, Beatrice walked the east fence line alone, something she did occasionally, the way you revisit a place that matters to you, and stood at the corner post where she and Orville had done their first real work together in those first days, when the fence had been broken and the land had felt like a problem too large to solve. The fence was solid now, the post straight and the wire properly tensioned, and the grass on both sides was the deep green of a prairie in good growing season. She could see the windmill turning against the blue sky and the barn roof beyond it, and the addition on the house that had been added with careful attention to the original structure's lines. She stood there for a while with her face in the wind, and thought about the woman who had ridden into Caldwell 3 years ago with a battered trunk and nothing else except a willingness to work, and thought about how completely that person had arrived in this particular place. She was walking back to the house when she met Orville coming out to find her, dust picking his way carefully along the familiar path with the ease of long habit. He pulled up when he heard her footsteps and the horse paused. "Where have you been?" he asked, not with worry but with the comfortable inquiry of a man who likes knowing where his wife is. "The east fence," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Our fence," he said. "Our fence," she agreed. "It is still standing." He reached down and she took his hand, and he held it for a moment in the May sunshine while dust stood patient beneath him, and the prairie stretched away in every direction toward horizons that were clear and wide and entirely their own. "I have been thinking," he said. "You are always thinking," she said. "What about?" "The kitchen garden," he said. "You said in March that you wanted to expand it to the south side of the house. I think we should do it this summer." She thought about the space he was describing, the area that got morning sun and was sheltered from the north wind, and that she had indeed looked at in March with the particular attention she gave to things that could be improved. "It would double the yield," she said. "Yes," he said. "Ruth will be old enough next spring to have opinions about it." She laughed, a full, genuine laugh that went out into the clear May air at the image of her 6-month-old daughter having opinions about the kitchen garden. "She already has opinions about everything else," she said. "Comes from her mother," he said with perfect innocence. "It absolutely does not," she said. He smiled, the real smile, the one that had been given only rarely in the beginning and now lived close to the surface of his face, available and unguarded. He squeezed her hand once and released it. "Come home," he said. "James has been asking for you." She walked beside the horse back to the house, through the gate she had ridden through 3 years ago with nothing but her stubbornness and her skills and a letter signed O. Abbott that had asked for only honest work, and into the yard where James was sitting in the dirt outside the kitchen door, conducting a serious conversation with a chicken who was showing only limited interest, and where Ruth was somewhere inside with Dewey's mother, who had taken to dropping by with such regularity that she had essentially appointed herself a member of the household's extended family. The house was warm and smelled of the stew she had left simmering, and the cedar of the new addition, and the particular combination of things that made a place smell like itself, and like no other place in the world. She hung her hat on the peg by the door and looked at the kitchen, the clean accounts on the desk, the account books that told the story of a ranch turned from the brink, the window that had new glass in it and let in the afternoon light without apology, the calendar on the wall turned to the correct month, and she thought, "This is the life, this exact one." Not a life that was supposed to belong to someone else, not a life she had been permitted or allowed or assigned, but one she had walked into with open eyes and built with her own hands and the hands of the man she loved, on a piece of land in Kansas that had refused to fail because they had refused to let it. She heard Orville's boots on the porch, and James looked up from his conversation with the chicken and shouted her name with the enthusiastic volume of a small person for whom volume is a feature rather than a bug. And from inside the house, Ruth made a sound that was the sort of sound that means a baby is waking from a nap and forming opinions about the situation. Beatrice Donnelly Abbott went inside to her family, in the house on the prairie, in the late afternoon light of a Kansas spring, in the year 1882, and everything was exactly what it should be, and everything was hers.